where we have communion at the end, it always throws me off. I feel like I'm forgetting something because I'm up here earlier than normal. But invite you to turn to John chapter 6 this morning as we continue to work our way through this gospel. And this morning we're going to find ourselves in verses 16 through 21. I've never seen nor have I witnessed the refining of a precious metal such as silver or gold. In James Montgomery Boyce's commentaries on John, he does tell of the silversmiths working in the bazaars in the Near East who will take coins from the tourists and then they will melt them down and make them into some sort of jewelry for the tourists. This process is done in the open, and it's done in a very primitive way. As the smith melts the coin down, he or she continues to look over the pot, going back to the pot time and time again, and they scrape the dross off of the top of the silver that's being refined. When the smith is then asked, why do you continually look into the silver? The answer is typical, that the dross needs to be continually removed as it's separated from the pure metal. Not only until the smith can look into the pot and see his reflection clearly in the silver is the process done. Not until he can see his reflection clearly does he know and realize that the dross is gone. All the impurities are out of the way. This is somewhat of a picture of what the Lord does for his people. He not only gives faith, but he refines it. He grows it. He matures it. He causes our faith to bear fruit. He purifies it, all until he can see his own reflection, you might say, in his people. In Malachi chapter 3, verses 3 and 4, we read, "He will sit as a refining and purifier of silver. And he will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver, and they will bring offerings in righteousness to the Lord. Then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasing to the Lord, as in the days of old and as in former years." See, God is working in his people to make us more like him, to cause us to worship him in ways that please him. As much as our passage this morning is about Jesus and his deity, it's just as much about him growing and purifying the faith that he has given us. See, if you remember throughout this whole account, John has constantly confronted his readers with the reality of who Jesus is. He is the Son of God. If you've been with us for any amount of time during this study and you've missed that, I need to do something different because the point has not been more clear in John's gospel. He is equal to God. He is God. But with that then, John continues, and he has continued to lay out for us what true saving faith is, what real belief is. And at times we've noticed, and at times we're going to continue to notice, that it's hard to discern and to recognize the difference between true saving faith and damning belief. His true disciples have the first, and the simple crowds, the populace, was confined to the second. And one quick biography of Peter is enough to make us wonder about his faith at times. He constantly was putting his foot in his mouth, manifesting his ignorant arrogance or his cowardly faith, but all the while knowing, as you look back, that Peter's faith was indeed true. One ingredient of saving faith that we will see this morning is that it is a faith that, yes, had a beginning and was enough to bring about justification, wholly and finally. But we also know that it is a faith that grows, a faith that becomes more and more pure, and it grows and bears fruit. Sometimes our faith looks like the faith of the disciples in their early years, weak and little, but yet it remains steadfast and enduring, persevering and eternal. And this is what we continue to see as we not only work through our passage this morning, but as we work through the rest of this account and as we look at the rest of Jesus' ministry here on earth. So please stand with me one more time in honor of God's Word as we read our verses together this morning. In John chapter 6, verses 16 to 21. John continues in this account, saying, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land to which they were going. Pray with me. Father, we give you this time this morning. We pray as your word is read, as we look at its truth, that your Spirit would impress upon our hearts and our minds who Jesus is and what he continues to do for us as his people. Lord, be gracious to us and merciful to us. Open our eyes and our ears. And Lord, don't let us leave here unchanged. And we do all of this for your glory and honor. In Jesus' name, amen. Please be seated. Now, there are some who claim that this section and what John records for us here is to be his 5th sign. If you remember the Gospel of John, John writes and gives us signs that point us to the deity of Jesus Christ, that he truly is the Son of God. Now, there are others who would not include this in one of these signs. Now, obviously, there is certainly a sign here, and it points very clearly to the deity of Christ. But I do not believe that this was John's intention to give us the 5th sign. This is not a public sign, much like the other signs. It's a private sign, and it's designed for more than just proving the deity of Christ. As we will see, I believe that there's more going on, and there's more than just one miracle happening here. Jesus is certainly putting his authority and power on display. But it is being done solely for the purpose of teaching his disciples a lesson, helping them in their faith. Again, this is not a detail that disrupts the meaning and the intent of John in telling the story, but I do believe that this is distinct from the other signs. If you remember back to a couple weeks ago, John began this whole section in chapter 6. It was the beginning of another discourse that Jesus has with a person, or in this case, a group of people. John began with the 4th sign of Jesus feeding the 5,000 and their companions. This smorgasbord of yummy barley bread and fish happened towards the end of that day that John speaks of. And now, beginning in verse 16, we see that evening had come, and it was now dark. It was getting dark. It was dark. Luke is the only other gospel writer that does not include this event in his account. You'll find this in Matthew chapter 14. You'll find it in Mark chapter 6. And we'll certainly borrow from those 2 accounts as we try to fill in some of the details that John leaves out. But John avoids some of these details that Matthew and Mark put in and include. But remember, John's point is very direct, and it fits into his overall purpose of writing. Again, to prove the deity of Jesus and what saving faith is. And so he doesn't repeat a lot of the details that Matthew and Mark have in their account. He only uses what he needs to get his point across. But from Mark, if you look at that account, we see that Jesus tells these men to go get into the boat. Get into the boat and head to Bethsaida. Which, this is not a contradiction, because you would have had to have sailed past Bethsaida to get to Capernaum. Jesus does not go with them, I believe, for 2 different reasons. One, Mark tells us that Jesus had dismissed the crowds, and then he went to find a place to pray. This was a common practice of Jesus's. especially when he is about to do something big. And we're on the cusp of something big in the ministry of Jesus. This discourse is really the beginning of the end. See, if you look at Jesus in verse 22, he begins to lay out in no uncertain terms that he is the Son of God, that he is God. He makes these statements. He begins to make these statements, these I am statements. And these statements begin to separate the wheat from the tares. I am the bread of life. The first of these I am statements that make it clear as to who Jesus is claiming to be. And it's now then, when he makes this statement, the crowds and some of those who've claimed to be his disciples begin to unfollow him. They cancel him. And so in preparation for this, Jesus goes to the Father. He prepares himself. He prepares his people for what he is about to disclose. So he goes to have communion with the Father and to be strengthened for the days ahead. I think the second reason that Jesus sent the disciples on ahead of him as he went to pray is what we read up in verse 6 of chapter 6. He says he sent them ahead without him to test them, for he himself knew what he was about to do. I think this point that Jesus, or what he says to Philip, also applies to this verse. Before he taught things that would prove the faulty faith of the masses, he needed to strengthen the faith of his true disciples. And these men who would be some of the few who would remain till the end. So John tells us that these men obey. These men get into the boat at dark and they start their voyage across the sea. It was dark and it was not uncommon at this time, due to the geography, topography of this sea in this area, for high winds to blow across the water, and for that to make those winds and storms to make the water very rough, making it very hard to row a boat. But making it about halfway across the sea, these men seem to have stalled out a bit and were no longer making any progress. We read that this is then when the Son of God shows up, walking on the water. Again, we see some very subtle yet very important details that John gives us. There are many theories out there that attempt to explain away what these disciples and what was really happening. One of them is that men claim that Jesus was not really walking on the water, but he was simply walking along the shoreline. But again, John tells us there's no way that someone would be able to see Jesus on the shoreline from 3 or 4 miles out in the middle of this sea. And he certainly would not be walking towards them if this was the case. Others claim that Jesus was with these men the whole time. But John debunks that in the very beginning. And even as you look down to verse 22, the crowds, all 200,000-ish of them, would know that, and did know that Jesus had not gotten in the boat with them. I do wonder what happened to the 12 basketfuls of leftovers, though. I'm not sure soggy barley bread would be all that good. But all of this, John uses to make sure that his readers know without a doubt that Jesus the Creator was not bound to his creation. If he made the water, he can certainly command it to hold him up. If he determined natural laws such as gravity, he would have the authority and prerogative to be sovereign over it. In no way was he, as the Son of God, subject to that which he created. And John tells us then that these men were frightened. They were afraid. Mark tells us that they were afraid because they thought he was a ghost, and this caused them to cry out. But the only thing that John tells us that eased their fear was his voice, was the voice of the Messiah, the comfort that came from hearing him, and in that they recognized him. Matthew then goes on to tell us that this is the point in time when Peter cries back to Jesus. He says, "If it is you, Lord, tell me to walk out on the water to you." And Jesus did. And Peter walked on the water as well. And when these men realized then who it is that was walking towards them, they took him into the boat And John says immediately they arrived at their destination. Again, certainly, this is another miracle that points us to the deity of Christ, as we have seen and as we know. But I think, as John often does, he has more here for us than just that. This is a narration of the power and authority that Jesus has over all of creation, and the power and authority that it has over the laws by which he set it in motion, and by the laws in which he sustains it. But beyond that, this is a story of faith. A faith that is given, and a faith that grows, and a faith that is infused. It bears fruit in all of life. And Jesus is using this event to grow the faith of his disciples. The multitude and the crowd is no longer around. No one else is there. This is a specific lesson to help his followers in their faith. And we see this faith grow as John narrates this event to us. But we also see a contrast that John often does, a contrast between a weak or little faith and that with a growing faith. And as we work our way back through this narration this morning, we're going to see three characteristics of both these men, or both of a weak and little faith, and three characteristics of a growing faith. In verses 16 through 19, we see a little faith. Although we know from Mark's account that it was Jesus who told these men to get into the boat and head to Capernaum, we can't help notice phrases such as, his disciples went down, got into a boat, and started across the sea. But probably the most telling phrase that John makes is this, and Jesus had not yet come to them. I don't believe that these men were in any way disobedient in not waiting for the Lord. Again, he's the one who told them to go ahead of him and that he would meet him there. And I don't think there's any impatience or them getting out ahead of Jesus here. But what I do think is revealed to us, and what I do think John is trying to communicate to us, is these men were still relying upon themselves in order to obey this command. Many of them, remember, were fishermen. They would have known what the evening hours could bring out on the Sea of Galilee. More than likely, they had experienced it themselves. And although they knew it would be difficult, they had done it before and they had made it on their own. In fact, as you read this narrative, John doesn't tell us that the men were even frightened about the storm or the sea until they saw Jesus. They only became this way because they saw what they believed to be a ghost walking towards them on the water. Now, these men were given a command, and they had determined that they would be able to obey it on their own. They were self-sufficient. We're going to see this again in the life of Peter. John tells us of an interaction between Jesus and Peter in chapter 13, verses 36 to 38. John says, Simon Peter said to Jesus, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus answered him, where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow afterward. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, the rooster will not crow till you have denied me 3 times. See, Peter's self-sufficiency caused him to actually miss the whole point of what Jesus was saying. It caused Peter to boast. It caused him to not pray in the garden. It led him to the point where he denied Jesus 3 times, all because he was relying upon his own strength. And so these men on the sea set out without Jesus. They knew the likelihood of the storm and its effects, and yet nowhere do we see that they had asked Jesus to get them there safely, because they thought they were the masters of the sea and that they did not need to rely upon Jesus. See, weak faith, little faith, manifests itself in arrogant self-sufficiency. And this self-sufficiency manifests itself in several different ways, in this instance and in our own personal lives. We think we can sail and row against the waves on our own. We boast in our ability to obey. We may not say it out loud. It may not even be conscious. But how often do we try to obey on our own? We spend very little time in prayer, where we pray for things to go our way or for others. But do we take our sin, do we take our desires, do we take our serving, our worship, our whole life serious enough to know that we can't truly live a life that is pleasing to God without Him? And without Him working in us to accomplish that? Do we really think we need Him to live a life that pleases Him? And we make little to no progress in our spiritual lives because we're attempting to do it on our own. See, weak faith, little faith, believes that Jesus saves, but after that, you're on your own. And this is an error that needs to be dismissed entirely from our thinking. Absolutely, Jesus saves, but that salvation does not end with our justification. He who began a good work in you He will be faithful to complete it. Jesus does not let go. Ever does He let go of the rope. Neither should we. There's nothing else for us to grab hold of. All of us have tried to go at it on our own. And we need to constantly remind ourselves how that went. But as our faith grows, our self-sufficiency will become less and less. Verse 18, we see the next characteristic of weak or little faith, and that's one of forgetfulness. In verse 18, John uses some words here that Matthew and Mark do not necessarily use in the same way. When he is describing the roughness of the waves and the strength of the wind, he's using words of emphasis. Unlike Matthew and Mark, John is emphasizing the situation. And again, I think the storm in the sea certainly would have had the disciples a bit concerned. Who wouldn't be? Yet they are not yet frightened. However, John's emphasis is such that he's communicating that the storm and the sea are making progress very difficult and quite impossible. And here it may be a result of this self-sufficiency that we just talked about, because they thought they could do it on their own, but because of that, they forgot who it was that was more than able to get them across the sea. In Mark 4:35-41, we're told of another instance when the disciples found themselves on the rough sea. This time it was a great storm, Mark says. Water was filling the boat and it was going to sink. This time, however, Jesus was with them and He commanded the wind and sea to be still, and it obeyed. And it was these same men who are the ones struggling against this very same circumstance when they personally knew the one who had complete sovereignty and authority over them. Well, you might say, yeah, but Jesus wasn't with them in John chapter 6. Okay. Well, these men were there in John chapter 4 when Jesus, from 20 miles away, commanded a fever to leave a little boy, and it did. Jesus, the Son of God, did not need to be present in order to heal the boy, and He wouldn't have needed to be present to stop this storm either. And remember what had just happened hours before. Jesus had made bread and fish for a very large crowd to eat, and He did this because He had compassion on the ones He loves. He loves those and He cares for them. And these men forgot. They forgot that Jesus, the Son of God, is the one who created the wind and the water. That nature is just as much under His authority now as it was the first time He told it to be still, and just as much now as it was in the beginning when He spoke it into existence. They forgot that Jesus, the Son of God, is not bound by space or time. That He always wasn't, and that He did not need to be present physically in order to perform a miracle. And they forgot that Jesus, the Son of God, is loving and compassionate, and He will take care of His own. that he loves those whom he calls, and he will not let one thing happen to them that is outside his good, loving, sovereign will. Weak faith, little faith forgets who Christ is and what he's done. It forgets the power and authority he has. It forgets the love and compassion he has. It forgets who he is. And weak faith, little faith will only grow as we learn and remind ourselves of these things in the midst of hard times. This is so important for us, brothers and sisters. We must preach and we must teach and we must remind ourselves of these glorious truths, and we must come alongside of others when they are struggling as well with these very same things, so that we might stand fast and so that our faith might grow. Verse 19, we have the final aspect of weak faith that we see in this event, and it's fear. Again, in verse 19, the disciples see Jesus, and John says that's when they became frightened. Now, there can be numerous reasons why these men were afraid. I think one of my first emotions would be fear if I was watching someone walk on water towards me 3 miles out from the nearest shore. I'm also sure that there were tensions. There was stress, a high level of stress with the storm and waves and the way they were, and so that would have added to the situation. It was dark. Maybe they would have been afraid that the shore was really that close and they were somehow lost. But really, Mark and Matthew help us here a bit. They tell us that the disciples were scared because they thought a ghost was walking towards them. Some sort of vision or spirit was coming upon them. The darkness, the high winds causing the water to rise and fall, all of it would have had some effect on seeing clearly. But it all boils down to this. They were frightened. They were scared because they did not recognize Jesus. Their weak faith, their little faith blurred their vision of seeing Christ clearly. If they had just believed, if what they had seen had been taught, it was taken to heart and mind, they would not have had any trouble knowing who it was that was walking to them on the water. They would have had no trouble knowing that the creator of the water and the ruler of the natural law had complete authority to change them both. The wind and the waves had already obeyed once, they could obey again. Why couldn't the water obey so that it would hold him up? And our fear as well, brothers and sisters, whatever that might be or however it shows up in our lives, is a result of not knowing or recognizing or treating God as He is. We fear finances. We fear bad health. We fear apostate children. We fear elections. We fear trials. We fear persecution. We fear man. We fear. And in it all, we fail to recognize the sovereign ruler who is in control of everything. That nothing, absolutely nothing, comes into our lives that is not from Him. That is not from His good and wise and loving hand. We forget who it is who is on the throne and who is in control, and that He is good, and nothing happens that is not for His glory and our good. And we allow the darkness and the waves of life to distort our vision of Him, and we allow them to keep us from knowing who it is that's coming towards us walking on the water. These things keep us from knowing that who this is not under the control or influence of He is in control of our circumstances. See, brothers and sisters, God ordains situations like this so that the dross will be removed, so that the heavenly silversmith might see his reflection in the silver more and more clearly. Weak and little faith fear because it doesn't recognize Christ in the things that are going on around us. And so, In his love and care for the disciples and in his desire to glorify the Father, Jesus comes to these men of weak and little faith, not to save their lives, but to strengthen their faith. And he comes walking on the water, not a sandbar, not a shoreline, not some sort of thick and heavy seaweed or lily pads. Jesus was walking on the water. Ryle says this about the water. It says they bore him as firmly as the pavement of the temple or the hills around Nazareth. It was just as easy for him to walk on the seas as to form the sea in the beginning. Just as easy to suspend the common laws of nature, as they are called, as to impose laws at the first. See, these men not only needed this in this very moment, but they needed it for the future. In this whole story, in this whole event, Jesus is preparing them for greater things, and their faith needed a boost, and he provides it. And we see in the next couple of verses what this boost of faith, what this growing faith look like, and what it does look like in these men. And we see this in verses 20 to 21. The first characteristic is there in verse 20. We notice that it's a faith that recognizes Christ. It is a faith that does know him. In verse 20, John tells us that the fears of these disciples were settled not because Jesus stopped the wind and calmed the seas, but by simply speaking, simply telling them who it was that was coming towards them walking on the water. It is a fact that they should have already recognized. Now, there is some discussion regarding the wording of what Jesus says. In the Greek, "it is I" is only two words. And it's the very same two words that are translated "I am" later on in the gospel, in the other gospels as well. With this, though, most commentators do not disagree with the English translation, "it is I." They say that this would have been very common, or a very common way to translate these two words. And Jesus is not, at least at this point in time, is not necessarily using this phrase to claim to be the great I am that spoke with Moses from the burning bush. In fact, out of all the commentaries I read, only one of them would have used the "I am" translation. And I tend to lean towards the "it is I" translation because I'm simply a crowd follower. No, that's not true. I lean that way because I believe these men at some level already knew that Jesus was the great I am. He'd already proclaimed it. Jesus was not necessarily declaring who he was. He was simply making himself further known to those who already knew this fact. In either case, again, splitting hairs can be dangerous, but what Jesus said or caused these men to stop being frightened simply says, "Do not be afraid. It's me. It's me." Reading this account in Matthew, we know that this didn't happen all at once for these men. Again, Matthew tells us of Peter asking Jesus to prove himself. "If it's really you, Jesus, have me come walk out here on the water to you." But the sound of his voice and the truth of his words was enough for these men's fears to subside. It's also helpful to notice that in this response of Jesus, that the command, "do not be afraid," is passive. This command to not be afraid is obeyed as we know and understand who Jesus is. It flows from "it is I." I am the one who's already calmed a raging storm and mighty waves, Jesus says. I am the one who is healed, who has cast out demons. I am the one who's made enough food to feed a host of people. And now I am the one who is coming to you on the water. I'm not bound by the flesh. I'm not restricted by distance or time. I am over all things. The things of this world and the things of the spiritual realm. Do not be afraid. Let the truth of who I am bring you peace. And there's a wonderful lesson here for us as well. A faith that is growing is a faith that turns to the Lord in hard times, times of trial and struggle, times of sorrow and pain, times of trepidation and fear. And then that fear is comforted, that we are comforted by the words of Jesus. The truth of who He is helps us in life's hardest days and hours. See, so much of what we are being told today, and sadly even in many churches, is to go somewhere else for courage and comfort. And we weaken our faith even more when we turn to find comfort and satisfaction in someone or something other than Christ. Peace, a lack of fear, whatever that might be, is a result of knowing who Christ is and growing in a relationship with Him. Do you believe that Jesus is over all things? Do you believe that He is subject to nothing and to no one? Do you believe that He holds all things in the palm of His hands? Do you believe that He has decreed all things from before time has began? Do you think Jesus is surprised by what's happening to you? You think He just throws His hands up, says, "Whew, good luck, buddy"? Do you know the one who says, "It is I"? Do not be afraid. The second aspect of growing faith that we see in these verses is that growing faith causes us to desire Christ. And we see this at the beginning of verse 21. We read, "Then they were glad to take Him into the boat." See, as a result of knowing who this now was, who was walking on the water, these men gladly receive Him, the ESV says. They were glad to take Him in. Now, John often uses this word that's translated glad in this gospel to refer to a desire of the will, a wanting to, a desiring it. It became their purpose. It became their mission. See, once these men knew it was Jesus, their hearts, their wills, their desires were such that they wanted Him in the boat. They desired Him to be where they were. They wanted Him close by. It's not a passive wish. It's not hoping that He gets in there with them. It was their purpose to get Him into the boat. Jesus no longer had not come to them. He was there, and they could not get Him in the boat with them fast enough. See, these men's faith was growing as they recognized Jesus, and in knowing Him, they desired Him, and desiring Him, it was their will to be with Him. The Psalms are filled with examples of this. Many Psalms, we find the psalmist finding himself in some sort of distress from others or himself or just life. He then begins to recall the faithfulness and attributes of God. He begins to recognize God and what He knows of Him. And he oftentimes expresses his desire to be with Him. And it's in this moment that all of these issues that the psalmist is writing about just seem to disappear. A growing faith begins to manifest itself in the will of those who truly believe. They begin to be glad in the things of Christ. Their wills begin to choose what is right and heavenly. They begin to act upon the will of the Spirit. They want what Christ wants. Their purpose is to be with Him, to please Him, to look like Him, to have His reflection be seen in them. Is this where your will is headed? Is this where your desires rest and flow out of? Is there growth in this in your life? See, the crowds, as we will see in the coming weeks, did not have this gladness, this desire. Their hearts were not transformed, therefore their wills were not conformed to the will of God. This is not something that man can do. The leopard cannot change his spots, and man cannot change his desires or his will. And we know that it's true that this is a process in so many ways. We see this in the disciples, right? They continue to pursue their own wills. Again, poor Peter. I know he gets picked on quite a bit. But he's the one that rebukes Jesus. When Jesus says that he's going to die, and what does Jesus say in response? Both Matthew and Mark tell us the words of Jesus. Get behind me, Satan. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Jesus says, you don't want what I want, Peter. You're only wanting what you want. And this change of desire, this change of our wills, sometimes comes in trials. Sometimes it comes through conviction of sin and rebuke and repentance. At times it comes in the midst of fear. But we can be assured that those who have saving faith will grow in desiring Christ and the things that bring Him glory. Finally, this morning, the third aspect of growing faith we find in the last part of verse 21. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Growing faith is a trusting faith. And once again, we have some disagreements as to what John is really describing happened here. Most theologians, and I was shocked, most theologians that I read do not recognize another miracle here. They claim that because of the calming of the sea and wind, that the immediacy of their arrival to their destination was just simply the ease to which they got there on smooth water, that the rowing became easy. Neither Matthew nor Mark comment on this, and so they say this is further evidence against another miracle being done. Now again, none of them claim that Jesus couldn't have miraculously transferred them to land, but they doubt that this is what happened. I'm not there. I believe this is another miracle. Jesus walked on water, and once again He stopped the wind from blowing and He caused the waves to settle down. Why not a third miracle here? See, and again, John does not use this word that we translate immediately very often. Only 3 times in this gospel does he use it. But the other 2 times he does use it, he means immediately. There's been no time lapse in between at all. John uses words that have meaning. So I believe Jesus got in the boat, the storm stopped, and they were at their destination. I think it's as simple as that. These men were at the end of the ropes. They'd been rowing all night, only to get halfway across the sea. They'd used all their strength, they'd used all their knowledge, all their experience. Everything had come to a halt. And now Jesus, who had just rebuked their doubt, Matthew tells us, gets into the boat. And they are now at Capernaum. No longer self-sufficient. No longer forgetful. But only Christ gives us the ability to obey Him. And only He can get us to our destination of obedience. Paul says this same thing, this tension between man's responsibility and what God does in our sanctification and our obedience. In Philippians 2:12-13, he says, "Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling." So I believe these men were trying to work out their salvation in some way in fear and trembling. They were trying to obey. But they didn't finish the verse when Paul says, "For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure." All that has been asked of these men, even simple instructions such as getting themselves to Capernaum, all that will be asked of them to give their lives for the gospel cannot be obeyed, it cannot be accomplished apart from the work of God in them. And I believe these men, their trust grew in this moment. The reliance upon Jesus grew. And we need to grow in this as well. Yes, we must obey, but it can only truly be done as God works in us for His good pleasure. So we'll continue to see this is not the end of this process for these men. We read that in the days and months ahead, several of them will even forget the feeding of the 5,000 when they question Jesus on how He's going to feed only 4,000 men. But we do know that this faith is real because it grows. It produces fruit, and it perseveres and is used for the glory of God. Jesus is refining these men, and He refines you and me. He refines His people. He continues to grow our faith so that we will not only see Him more clearly, but that He is seen in us more clearly. And this is an encouraging story for us, believer. See, it doesn't necessarily matter where you are at with the Lord as long as your faith is a saving faith. Because He promises and He is able to take your faith where it is today and to grow it. He will not allow you to become stale and stagnant. He will produce in you exactly what He wants. It doesn't mean it's always going to be easy and fun, but He will keep you and He will grow you. So as the men come forward to help serve